I thought I'd start by bringing you some news, which is that tomorrow, tomorrow is going to be a big announcement from Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband and Rachel Reeves. But first we knew of it was this morning when I got an excited call from Desnes saying, can you come to a briefing at 3 o'clock today? The second thing I knew about it was when the political team came up and said, we've been invited to a briefing with Keir Starmer. Mine was with Ed Miliband. And the third was when the economics editor came up and said, I've been invited to a briefing with Rachel Reeves. The briefing is all about an announcement tomorrow, which is that the government's putting £22 billion into a couple of carbon capture projects, one at HyNet, which is the project in Liverpool, and the other which is in the east of England, Humberside and Teesside. And there's another carbon capture and hydrogen production project. And knowing I was coming here today, I was just looking at this and thinking, well, all of this, 3 senior ministers all trying to brief journalists and our journalists fighting over who's going to be doing the briefing and write the story, is a consequence of what you do, Jim. It directly relates back to the work of the IPCC. And talking also to my fellow journalists, I was saying, well, do you know what it's actually about? Do you know what? And it turned out the politics team wanted to see Keir Starmer to ask him who'd paid for his suit. It turned out that the environment editor was very keen to go there and knew something about it, and so did we. But we lost the battle, and the politics team took it. But anyway, it makes the point just how much the IPCC's work feeds into the kind of things that we're seeing in policy and in government and in the media. And I just thought it was really worth emphasising that it all comes back to the reports that you and your predecessors and colleagues have put out. But what also struck me in talking to a lot of the people I work with is how little they actually know about the basics of climate change. So I thought this would be a great opportunity, and also talking to people in your area, climate professionals, you might call it, as to how the basic science sometimes gets forgotten. So I thought, Jim, we might take this opportunity just to look back at some of the key figures. So what I'm going to do is ask you a series of questions, if I may, and then basically very simple science, the stuff that we think we know but often don't. And then just explore some of the basic facts and figures, and then when we've gone through that, we'll come to the audience and have some time for questions. So I think what I'm going to do is approach it in terms of your report. So you've got your physical science, your adaptation, your mitigation reports, and we'll just look at each one of those and just try and draw out the real key figures from each one. So actually, we've got a slide as well. I've ambushed you with this. So can we have the slide up as well?
Yeah.
And if you...
I think I'm about to be like a politician asks the price of a pint of milk here. So this is...
There's your graph.
Yeah.
It's on behind you as well, if you...
Yeah.
So what I thought, if you take a look at this graph, I kind of see this graph as fairly central to what the IPCC is doing. I hope you agree with that, Jim. And what it shows is essentially the top red line is where we are in terms of emissions, and the green and the blue lines are where we need to be. And I've always found these figures quite astonishing, and whenever I look at this graph, I'm kind of reminded of that. So tell me if I've got this interpretation right, but as I understand it, to get to the 1.5, to stay within the 1.5C target, we need to go from where we are now, which is roughly 60 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent, down to 30 billion tonnes by 2030, and then 20 billion tonnes by 2040. Or we can relax a little and cut it to 30 billion tonnes by 2040 to stay within 2 degrees. Take a look at the red line, and you just see how far away we are. So I wonder, Jim, if you could just talk a little about the meaning of that. And the key question for me is, have policymakers really understood what you're saying with these kinds of figures.
Yeah, when we approve these reports, we have to do it word for word and line by line with governments. And I can assure you they gave us a really hard time on these numbers. And if you look at what it says, the words actually matter. It doesn't say we must reduce emissions by 43%. It says, by the insistence of governments, that in global modelled emission pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees, emissions fall by 43%. And the sentence has been constructed in such a way that it is talking about these scenarios as artifacts rather than about the real world. So you can see the kind of the get out of jail free in the way that the sentence has actually been drafted. You will note from these pictures the big decline in emissions starts from 2019, the first sort of normal, the last normal pre-COVID year. And of course, we have gone over the last 3 to 4 years, emissions have picked up again. The remaining carbon budget, because emissions of carbon dioxide are cumulative, has been used up. So when we produced the report, we said the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 was about 500 gigatons, which is about 10 years worth of global emissions. The recent papers that have come out because of changes in estimates of the sensitivity of the Earth to emissions, and also because of the emissions that have occurred since then, have said that that budget now may be as little as 200 billion tons. In other words, about 4 or 5 years worth. So we are easily crashing against 1.5. It is slipping away from us. Absolutely true.
Yep. And then what about 2 degrees? I mean, if I look at that graph, I can see a glimmer of hope for 2 degrees, but not much hope for 1.5.
Well, I mean, that's the picture. And if you went to the subsequent figure in our report, it would also show you what happened if you got the nationally determined contributions by 2030, but no more, and then subsequently tried to hold emissions to 2 degrees. And it is still possible, but the possibility of 1.5 is gone if we just hold to the current NDCs by 2030.
And I think the NDCs are coming in for next time around now.
Yeah, they at COP30, which will be in Belém in Brazil, it's the job of the Brazilian presidency to shepherd in a new set of NDCs, which by agreement the countries are supposed to be 1.5 aligned. Now, how you do that is an interesting trick.
Yeah. Just by the way, I think the Brazilian meeting is in a fairly small town in the Amazon.
It's actually in the Amazon, yeah.
So book your hotels now if you're going. And now here's a tricky one, okay? And feel free to duck the question, but obviously I don't think you will. We talk about 2100 as if it's a cut-off. If you look here, I think we probably finish at 2100. If you look in the physical science chapters, it does go beyond 2100 up to 2300. Yeah. And there is a very scary worst-case scenario of 14 degrees temperature rise. Yeah. Worst case, I stress. But it's difficult to predict 75 years plus ahead. And I wonder how confident you would feel about saying what we might expect if we carry on as now in following centuries.
Right. And just to say, we have the 3 working groups in IPCC, and the physical scientists are very comfortable about talking hundreds of years ahead. But obviously, I think, foreseeing what might happen, not predicting, because I don't think anybody can predict it. You have a 0 chance of getting it right. But anticipating what happens in 2100 from the social and the economic end is really quite difficult. Personally, I'm comfortable up to about 2 investment cycles ahead with the kind of models that are used. I can live with that, 2060, 2070. I think once you get to 2100, it does start to get fairly speculative.
Yeah, I note that there's, I think, a 3.2, no, up to 4 degrees cut-off at 2100. I mean, it just stops. So it obviously begs the question as to what may happen, and obviously it's so unpredictable.
Yeah. I mean, with the current implemented policies, we're probably, let me very unscientifically say, we're headed towards 3-ish degrees warming. That's if we carry on with the policies we have at the moment.
Yeah. Within that, there's a few sectors that where one might make a big difference with the political will. One of them is aviation. I wonder whether you feel able to say anything about the way aviation might be expected to go. Or
Well,
needs to?
I think actually the biggest opportunity is probably in the energy sector, because you can actually see a way of getting almost to net zero carbon dioxide emissions there. And the area in which you have a lot of uncertainty at the moment is the land sector. There are an awful lot of measures. It's not just afforestation or avoided deforestation. There are other measures like peatland restoration, agricultural practices, nature-based solutions that could play a role. Aviation, I think, has a lot of uncertainty. First of all, aviation is not covered by the Paris Agreement or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's dealt with through the ICAO and the aviation industry process, so it's very different. And I think a lot of the net zero numbers that are coming out the aviation industry assume that they will be able to purchase credits to achieve net zero that may be provided in the land use sector, which I've already mentioned. Now, the credibility of these credits is going to be a really, really important issue. I mean, frankly, many scientists have critiqued the scenarios assessed by IPCC, and one of the big critiques has been the reliance on land-based mitigation and the potential consequential impacts on biodiversity and food security. So there's a lot to be considered about this.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the Welsh Affairs Committees is holding an inquiry into the purchase of Welsh farmland by airlines to offset aviation emissions, which is causing a degree of concern amongst Welsh farmers. And obviously it's a change of use of land.
Yeah.
I know you can't comment on national policies, so I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. Okay, and then I suppose turning to a note of hope. The old reports also say that mitigation is possible. We can cut emissions, and we could cut them enough to stay within 2 degrees, probably not 1.5 now. But if you look at the data from the International Energy Agency, where I think oil has gone from 100 million barrels a day to 103 within a couple of years. Coal is going up still. We're at something like 8 billion tons. And gas is something in the region of 4.5 trillion cubic meters now, predicted to rise to 5.5 trillion. So if we think of all those, what's your hopes for mitigation, and how could we?
Well, I mean, just say the International Energy Agency produces a number of different scenarios with different philosophies. If you look, have you still got it up? If you look at the pink slice at the top, these would be the kind of business as usual sort of scenarios that the IEA produces. They also produce the aspirational scenarios, and they have produced scenarios that are compatible with 1.5 degrees warming and still say it's possible. I mean, these are the kind of inputs that have come into the most recent COPs. So I think the question is projecting what would happen if we carry on as we are and comparing it with the aspirations to actually be compliant with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Frankly, it's down to human agency and choice. As politicians, the political system can choose or can choose not to implement the measures that we'd like to take you in the direction.
Yeah, in a sense, that's the role of scientists, isn't it? To give people the evidence they need to make the decisions that need to be taken.
And just to emphasise, IPCC never makes recommendations. We only highlight the consequence of implementing particular policies.
So we've got some climate change anyway.
Yeah,
we're going to get probably some more. So my next question is really about adaptation. What do we need to do to cope with the climate change that we've got and which is coming, based on what we can foresee?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's say adaptation efforts have actually started, but as we observed in the last report, they're fragmented, and a lot of them are more about planning than actual implementation. And we are reaching hard limits to adaptation in some sectors and regions, and certainly soft limits, which are put in place by lack of institutional capacity. But it's very clear, climate change is no longer for decades in the future. It's very obvious it's happening now, so we need to adapt. And in fact, the next cycle of IPCC, there's going to be much more emphasis on adaptation than there has been in the past. The UNFCCC invited IPCC to produce guidelines on impacts and adaptation covering indicators, metrics and methodologies. We will be producing that report probably by 2028, and that will provide the mechanism for measuring government's progress against the global goal on adaptation, which is going to be heavily covered at COP29. The ministers from Ireland and Costa Rica will be co-chairing a group looking at the global goal on adaptation. It's going to be much more important, and it is particularly seen as important by developing countries who will be worst affected by the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, we talked about mitigation and adaptation, but I mean, I met the head of the Netherlands Flood Prevention Committee a while ago, and he was talking about raising the dikes by meters. I think it was 6 meters for some areas. Just astonishing. So we talk about adaptation, but a lot of it is actually large-scale engineering, isn't it?
Well, it's an interesting question. In fact, the Netherlands is effectively a giant peat bog that's already subsided by 8 meters, in the past. That has been, protected by seawalls. And for some people, that will be the solution. One of the things that scientists have often pointed out is the risk of what they're calling maladaptation, putting in place adaptation measures like seawalls that will have a limited life, because if warming continues, if sea levels rise, the seawalls, for example, will no longer be able to provide the defence. And maladaptation can involve putting up modest seawalls, building settlements behind it, and then the settlements are vulnerable once you get to the larger effects of climate change in the long run. So it's not just about the engineering needs done very, very carefully to look at the consequences. And we can already see issues around the coasts in Britain about houses falling off cliffs into the sea. There's not much you can do to adapt to that, and there are big debates about, do you retreat or do you protect? What's the best option?
I think there was a flood surge in the North Sea in 2013 where, I don't know if you ever looked at Google Maps for Lincolnshire, you'll see endless caravans behind the sea walls of Lincolnshire. And the flood surge came within inches of overtopping that. And that would be a good example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and of course there would have been the floods in southeast England in 1953 that had dire effects. And, the Thames barrier is being closed much more often than people anticipated and may well need new investment in the future.
So all of that begs my final question, which is, we're talking about massive engineering works, we're talking about adaptation, and we're talking about poorer countries not having the resources to actually achieve that. So last question is about money. There's a lot of hope in what you've done. We can cut emissions, we can adapt, but it's going to be expensive. Most emissions come from countries like ours, and a lot of the effects are going to be felt in poorer countries. So what can we do to get money moving to the right places?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, one of the things we looked at in the last report, we had a whole chapter on investment and finance looking at mitigation. And basically the conclusion was, compared with the amount of investment flows we've got at the moment, we would need to enhance these by a factor of about 4 to 6 if you were to put yourself onto a 1.5 or a 2-degree pathway. And, things are going quite well, say for renewable energy. China, Europe, North America, things are happening. They're not happening to the same extent in sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia. And, we do need to look at that. They need investment in infrastructure to allow their electricity systems to absorb renewables. And we need financial instruments that will reduce the cost of capital in these countries, reduce the risks so that private finance flows will start to move. Now, that all sounds difficult, but actually the mitigation bit is easy compared with the adaptation part of it, where almost all of the money that's flowing at the moment is public money, and public purses are not deep enough to actually support that. So what we do need to think about ways for adaptation is how to get private money to flow. And some of it may come through the insurance sector to protect against, insured assets. Some of it may come from companies with supply chains where the upstream, particularly in the food industry, where the production is vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And especially in the land and agricultural sector, there are lots of measures that have both mitigation and adaptation benefits. For example, building up carbon in soils. But there, I think we need to look at some of the discussions that are going to be taking place at COP29 about, for example, applying levies to fossil fuel production that would create the kind of revenues that would allow us to pay for adaptation measures and also loss and damage, which is going to be a really, really big issue. What do you about the damages that you can't, things that you cannot adapt to that are beyond adaptation, and the question of compensation for that?
Okay, and one last question from me, which is, you've mentioned we're heading towards 3 degrees, if we carry on as we are. But that's a global average. A global average is basically covering the sea and the land. And the warming we get over land tends to be, probably about 25-30% higher than we get over the sea. So that looks to me like 4 or 5 degrees over much of the land, maybe more in the Arctic as well. So turning all this into a kind of human scale, what would life be like in a world, and maybe in our country, when we've got 4 to 5 degrees of extra warming? Yeah,
more dangerous and less pleasant, to put it quite bluntly. I mean, one of the biggest risks in many parts of the world come from the risks related to a combination of heat and humidity. It can just be difficult, to live outside and to work outside. In some parts of the world, that will be really a showstopper for some kinds of economic activity. Sure, the land warms more than the oceans. The higher latitudes warm more than the tropics, and we've seen particularly large relative increases in warming in Europe compared with the rest of the world, associated with the kind of wildfires that we've seen. So yeah, it's not going to be good unless we actually take action to get emissions down. And a comprehensive climate action strategy is not all adaptation, it's all mitigation. It involves a mixture of the two if we're going to do it properly. And that would apply to the transport sector as well, because transportation infrastructure is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Jim. Now, I think we've got some time. Philip, are you going to wave at me if I run out of time?
We're hard up against it. We've got about 5 minutes or so.
So 3 or 4 questions, I think. So who would like to ask a question? Gentleman down at the bottom here, who you can reach easily, and then if you could just say who you are. And
Tim Chatterton, RAC Foundation. I'm not quite sure who we're asking questions to, but I wonder if either of you could comment on the role of the media in reporting on climate change events, or sort of wildfires, wind, flooding, without adequate descriptions of how climate change might play a role in it, and also coverage of what might politely be called scare stories about things like electric vehicles and heat pumps, and basically not playing a particularly supportive role in supporting the climate transition.
Do you want to do that?
Can I take maybe the first part on the scaremongering part of it? One of the advances that has been made from the physical climate scientists is the ability to attribute specific climate-related events to the effect of the emissions that people have put into the atmosphere. So people, I mean, you can't do it with absolute certainty, but they can attach a probability and say, for example, so don't take the number, it's a for example, there is an 80% chance that this particular climate event would not have occurred without the human intervention in the climate. And I'm actually quite happy with the way that has been reported in the media so far. Freddie Otto at Imperial College, who was one of my colleagues, is particularly one of the experts in that area, and has been able to communicate it, I think, extremely effectively.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. So about 10 years ago, I did a bit of research myself on this. I went into one of the databases for the media and counted, or had it count, the number of stories about climate change that have been published in something like the previous 5 years or 10 years, I can't remember now. And it came up to something like 25,000. Almost, and just sampling them, you could see that almost all of them were saying what the science was and what the threats were. But opinions back then weren't moving quite so quickly, although they possibly have now. And the conclusion I reached was that the media can report climate change endlessly, and probably does, and most of it is very much in line with the science. But the real thing that was missing, and in some areas still is missing, was leadership, political leadership. And that's what really tended to change the way people spoke and acted and so on. And I think you've seen that with recent governments of both sides, because they've, despite the fact they try and find tremendous differences between what they think, we're actually very lucky in Britain in having a consensus about climate, which has remained relatively unbroken. And that's one of the reasons why this country is probably showing such progress.
Just say the thing I'm more concerned about is the 50,000 scientific papers published every year on climate change, which is growing at 10% a year. This is a real challenge for an assessment body like IPCC.
Next question, I think.
Excuse me. Hi, Phil Churchman from University of Leeds. So in the few years I've been following the work of the IPCC, it seems like the reality is at the worst half of the end of the spectrum of projections from maybe 2 or 3 cycles ago. And we also hear a lot about tipping points, which I don't think you've mentioned in terms of sort of worst case scenarios, the ocean not being able to absorb as much carbon as we thought it was, and the ice sheets being undermined and so on. So I just wondered if you had any comment on kind of how likely is it that it could be significantly worse than the averages that you've been talking about?
I think we're talking about non-linear reactions there. Is that right?
Sorry?
I think we're talking about non-linear responses.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, break that into 2 parts. Is the world warming more quickly than we anticipated? And I think the jury is still out about whether the extremes that we've seen in the last year in terms of actual temperatures have been exceptional or not. I mean, I've been down to the Met Office to talk to them about that, and they would argue that we're still right at the edge of the, the envelope of uncertainty at the global level, but for some specific regional systems, we're certainly over the edge. The thing that struck me more about the last cycle was actually in the Working Group 2 report to look at this, the level of impacts and risks associated with a given level of warming, and there it's quite clear that the risks have gone up, and many more of the risks are associated with a transition from 1.5 to 2 degrees that were previous thought these transitions would happen at a higher level. So I think the risks to systems are certainly higher. I think the jury's still a little bit out on the speed of warming.
One more question. Anyone else? Gentleman down at the front.
Thank you. Is just the issue about taking people with you seems to be one of the most difficult challenges with all of this, getting the behaviour change. Is there a role for the IPCC, or where do you think that responsibility sort of lies? We've talked about strong leadership, and that applies locally and nationally. You provide the information, but I think leaders at all levels are struggling a little bit around taking people with you on this. So do you have any sort of thoughts or messages about perhaps, does more work need to be done on this? Can the IPCC do more on this, or where should that sort of responsibility be?
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about the IPCC's remit, it has a different mandate from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our role is to provide advice based on our assessment of the scientific literature as applied to both the climate change itself and to climate change actions. And we are commanded to be policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. So we don't do recommendations. That being said, we do spend a lot of time thinking about how we actually communicate our findings, and spend a lot of time in thinking about, for example, how we put together figures to make them striking. I'm not sure how useful that kind of one is in communication, but there have been some very striking and effective pictures that have come out of IPCC. And because I know I have to answer questions from people like Jonathan, and I've done BBC Hard Talk, I have certainly had my media training to help me survive some of the worst salvos that might come in. So we do think about it quite carefully, but it's not our job to tell policymakers what they should be doing, though I think they can draw the implications. Some of the facts speak very loudly for themselves, I think.
It's also probably worth saying that just the sheer scale of progress. I've been going to COP meetings and talking to people like Jim for a very long time. I can remember going to a COP meeting, I think it was at The Hague, where the Climate Change Coalition, I thought it was called, Fred Singer's outfit.
Oh, the Global Climate Coalition.
Yes,
Yeah.
And they were in there. They were a bunch of climate skeptics, basically negotiating with, I suspected, bribing some of the smaller countries to vote against what was going on. You'll see nothing like that now. The consensus is pretty solid. Mm-hmm. The science is widely accepted in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago, and the world, even if it's not politically agreed, is fairly scientifically agreed on what the problem is and what needs to be done. Yeah. So there is a long-term progress, I think.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I think 195 governments signed up to the statement in the last cycle that human beings are unequivocally the cause of the climate change we're seeing. And when you get to that level of consensus on such a strong statement, I think we have made a lot of progress. Because when IPCC started out, the existential question was, are human beings causing climate change? That's now been accepted, and the question is, what do you do about it?
Jim, many thanks.
Yeah.
That was brilliant.